Welcome to the 2021 Second African Philanthropy Conference. We are delighted that you were able to join us for the next 3 days of reflection, conversations, and celebrations. My name is Beginkosi Moyo. I will serve as your conference facilitator. I'm based at Wits Business School and I direct the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. To get us started, let me welcome Maurice Hadebe, who is the head of school at Wits Business School, to welcome you all and offer his reflections. Take it over, Maurice. Thank you.
The aim of this conference and the big theme is about our response to COVID-19, particularly in the role of philanthropy. And it's very important that we reflect on this subject of philanthropy in times of crisis. And I think this is very, very important that we do that so that we can pick up some lessons and be able to make sure that as a continent, we can respond very, very quickly before even international donors and international aid comes. We as Africans should be able to respond immediately, fast and quick and swiftly in order to be able to save lives and in the challenging times. And there will be sub-themes. The first day, we will be celebrating the African philanthropy, especially looking at the role of philanthropy in COVID-19. During this COVID-19, how did we respond? How did we manage it, the way we responded? What lessons are we learning? How can we improve to make sure that in the next pandemic, we are even better prepared? The second day focuses on the systems change and the many shifts to virtual platforms and innovations. There's a lot of things that have happened since the pandemic. When we were talking 4IR before the pandemic, I thought in my mind, well, it's going to happen in 20 years' time. But gee, the pandemic, when it happened, we all had to switch to online. Even this kind of a conference before the pandemic was not even unthinkable, although we had it but on a very small scale, these types of conferences. So that's day 2. Day 3, we'll look at the Pan-African way through which the continent can be united. The unity of this continent has been elusive for decades now. For some of us who've been around for a pretty long time, we know that even pre-colonial times, we talk about unity of Africa, and great leaders of our colonial liberators talk about African unity. Been elusive, but pandemics like this force us to reset our thinking and really see that unity is critical in order for us to survive, but not only survive, but to thrive in this kind of crisis. Because trust me, during crisis, there's a lot of things that shift. And part of the things that shift is about wealth, is about resources, and it's important, and opportunities also emerge in crisis. And it is very important that we're able to capture those opportunities and leapfrog Africa and take Africa out of poverty, unemployment, and inequality.
Good afternoon. My name is Emmanuel Echampo, and I am the Ellen Gurney Professor of History and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. I have the pleasure of serving as the Oppenheimer Faculty Director of the Harvard Center for African Studies. Welcome to the Second African Philanthropy Conference on Surviving COVID-19 and the Role of African Philanthropy. This event is a collaboration between many partners, including the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment at Wits, the Wits Business School, Trust Africa, the African Philanthropy Forum, Southern Africa Trust, the Africa Philanthropy Network, the East African Philanthropy Network, and the Harvard Center for African Studies Africa Office. Opened in 2017, the Center for African Studies Africa Office, based in Johannesburg, is our continental listening post, which manages our many collaborations and partnerships across Africa, engages with our alumni networks, and hosts public programming such as this on topics of importance to the African continent. In 2019, alongside our partners, we inaugurated this conference on the theme of the state of Africa philanthropy, setting the agenda. The moving spirit for this inaugural conference was Mrs. Tsitsi Masiyiwa and Delta Philanthropies. Philanthropists from Africa and around the world joined with NGOs, policymakers, the private sector, and academic researchers. We had the opportunity to explore a framework for African philanthropy, from assessing the need and landscape to discussing the role for diverse stakeholders, from religion to the legal field, and from policymakers to the diaspora. In these proceedings, we defined African philanthropy in the context of Ubuntu and other African philosophical traditions that bring together concepts of solidarity and dignity. We identified a need for African philanthropy to address Africa's development and democratic agenda, as well as for development finance and wealth creation. But we also learned that the lack of quality data and research around African philanthropy needs to be addressed in order for us to fully engage all stakeholders. We concluded our last conference with the shared aim of bringing key messages about African philanthropy to national and regional government agencies, the private sector, and civil society. And we noted the need to rethink philanthropy in terms of solidarity, dignity, love of humanity, and empowerment. Those themes in particular are at the forefront of this year's conversation on surviving COVID-19 and the role of African philanthropy. Over the last year and a half, all of us have been impacted by the threat of and losses from COVID-19. We would also be remiss in not acknowledging the unrest that South Africa endured in the last few weeks. It is in this context that we gather over the next 3 days to discuss how COVID has impacted the philanthropic space, how philanthropists have responded to changing needs and demands, the changing need of technology in this space, and how we bring Africa together moving forward in this conversation. We will also have the opportunity to hear select musical performances from some remarkable and distinguished musicians, and to honor a dear friend and colleague, Akwesi Edu, whose pioneering efforts opened up space for research and publications on philanthropy in Africa. It is in this spirit, with due acknowledgement of the trying times we live in, but optimism about the generosity of the human spirit and the power of coming together, even virtually, that we will continue this conversation over the next 3 days. Allow me to now introduce today's keynote speaker and our dear friend, Mrs. Tsitsi Masiyiwa. Tsitsi Masiyiwa is an African philanthropist and social entrepreneur. She is executive chair and co-founder of Higher Life Foundation, whose primary goal is to invest in human capital development to build thriving individuals, communities, and sustainable livelihoods. As a result of her work and experience establishing and growing Higher Life Foundation over the last 25 years, Tsitsi has become an advisor and thought partner to universities, national leaders, and social entrepreneurs on issues of education, health, leadership development, and youth empowerment. In 2017, Tsitsi established Delta Philanthropies as a vehicle for impacting investing and grant making. Delta Philanthropies seeks to unlock and catalyze innovative solutions to the elimination of poverty by convening strategic partnerships and incubating new development models. Her work has garnered global recognition, including honorary doctorates, degrees from Morehouse University in Atlanta, Georgia, Africa University in Mutare, Zimbabwe, as well as the prestigious Champions for Change Award for Leadership from the International Center for Research on Women. Tsitsi is a founding board member and the current board chair of the African Philanthropy Forum, a trustee of the Legatum Institute and the End Fund, a member of the Sesame Workshop Global Advisory Group, the Generation Unlimited Global Leadership Council, the International Advisory Board for Texas A&M University, the Yale Institute for Global Health Advisory Board, the Princess Trust International West African Advisory Board, and the Kenjin Tatsujin International Advisory Council. Her most recent appointments include 7 on the inaugural board of directors of Resolve to Save Lives, and as the co-chair of the Trinity Challenge Judging Panel. Tsitsi and her husband, Strive, have been signatories to the Giving Pledge since 2014. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Tsitsi Masiyiwa.
A very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Emmanuel. Oh my gosh, for that, that introduction. Thank goodness I have dark skin so you can't see me blushing. And it's good to see you. I also want to say thank you to Director Maurice Radebe for your kind words and your opening remarks. The 3 days that we are facing are going to be absolutely thrilling. And both gentlemen have energized us. So thank you also to all the speakers and the panelists who have gifted their time to lead through thoughtful conversations and very important issues within the African philanthropy sector. Huge gratitude to the organizers, Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment, CAPSI, African Philanthropy Forum, East Africa Philanthropy Network, Southern Africa Trust, African Philanthropy Network, Harvard Center for African Studies, and Trust Africa. Now that is true African collaboration, and that really is exciting. So well done on all the work that you're doing to advance philanthropy. Today, I have the honor of delivering the keynote speech. I will try to be as quick as I can. And I'm supposed to give an uplifting type of presentation. But before I do that, I just want us to take stock of the stark realities that our continent has faced and continues to live through. For almost 2 years now, we have all collectively experienced great loss and endured overwhelming sadness. Almost 170,000 Africans have lost their lives to COVID-19. Many connected today have lost a loved one, a parent, a child, a sibling, a friend, a colleague. So if you could please join me in a moment of silence as we remember and reflect on those who are no longer with us, and may they rest in eternal peace. In addition to personal losses, the continent has also experienced severe economic challenges. Economic growth on the continent has contracted by 2.1% in 2020, and poverty has increased dramatically, where we see more than 30 million people now living in extreme poverty on less than $1.90 a day. The pandemic situation has worsened an already dire hunger situation, with over 100 million people in Africa facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. Inequalities have grown across the board in education. School closures have impacted around 250 million students in sub-Saharan Africa, and adding to the 100 million children who are already out of school prior to the pandemic. So, and history has shown us that these challenges are not gender neutral. Women and girls have borne the brunt of the socio-economic fallout of the pandemic. Much of the progress made in advancing gender equality has been eroded as women and girls have been placed at greater risk of COVID-19 transmission, loss of livelihood, exploitation, and gender-based violence. These are a few challenges we face. However, despite the magnitude of the problems, we can also not underplay the collective philanthropic efforts that have been made across the continent to fight the pandemic. So please join me as we celebrate the work that has been achieved through people giving more, through agile philanthropy, through collaboration, and also amazing innovations. Philanthropy means love for humanity, as Professor said, and there's no greater way in which this has been displayed than the many people who have given of themselves to take care of loved ones, of communities at the height of the pandemic. I also want to recognize and say thank you to all our frontline workers, especially those in the health services, our doctors, our nurses, hospital auxiliary staff, who put themselves on the line to save as many lives as possible and to continue to do so today. We truly appreciate your service and dedication, even when the tools of trade and this life-saving PPE may not be readily available. But they're not the only ones who showed this exceptional love through giving. In 2020, more than half of local philanthropists across the African continent increased their giving, and over 1/3 of their budgets being directed to COVID-19 relief efforts. We have examples in Nigeria where the Coalition Against COVID-19, CACOVID, formed by more than 50 private sector and philanthropy leaders, raised 38 billion naira, an equivalent of $92 million, to support the government in its fight against COVID. In South Africa, the Solidarity Trust raised 3.39 billion rands, $232 million, through contributions from philanthropists, from foundations, from private institutions, in order to support the national health response. This generous and responsive giving contributed immensely to saving lives and protecting the most vulnerable of communities in our countries. And I have to say, being an African, that the currency through which you do your giving does not matter at all. The work of a naira, the work of a rand, the work of a shilling, the work of a Zimbabwean RTGS does the same amount of work that is done by a pound and a rand. So big thank you and congratulations to the generosity of the African people. We must also commend the agility demonstrated in response to the pandemic. Philanthropists have an advantage of being able to quickly redirect funding from other programs and put it where the need is greatest. Agile philanthropy also allows organizations to adapt their responses and deliver on their mandate in changing environments. One such example is the Orange Foundation, who, seeing a shortage of PPE, pivoted to support local tech hubs known as Solidarity Fab Labs to make visors for healthcare workers. The operation ran in 13 Solidarity Fab Labs in Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Egypt, Madagascar, DRC, Senegal, and Tunisia. I also want to speak about the determination and dedication by organizations of all sizes that we saw help many of our communities. In Kenya, for instance, grassroots organizations like Mutual Aid Kenya moved quickly to support at-risk families living in informal settlements that were affected by lockdowns with direct cash transfers, food parcels, and alternative supply chains for essential commodities. The diaspora community also played a critical role in our collective efforts. The US-based Ethiopia Diaspora Trust Fund, for example, provided $1 million in funding to assist Ethiopia's COVID-19 mitigation efforts through food assistance and also direct cash transfers. The impact of every contribution cannot be taken for granted and therefore must be appreciated. COVID collapsed a number of fragile systems with the fallout felt across multiple industries. And to fill the gap, we innovated, provided solutions that allowed us to adapt to the changing environment while ensuring that we did not leave people behind. And we saw an example of this through innovations in Egypt, where the Sawiris Foundation for Social Development observed that while others had moved to online solutions during the pandemic to support businesses the most marginalized in society could not go digital due to the lack of equipment and resources. So to allow local artisans access to online markets, the foundation brokered a deal with major online sales platforms and provided capacity building and financing to these small businesses. Another great example of innovation is the development of over 120 health technology solutions that have been piloted or adopted in Africa since 2020. The introduction of the Africa Medical Supplies Platform, which provides African countries with access to medical equipment and supplies transparently and cost-effectively, is one such solution. Others include WhatsApp chatbots in South Africa, self-diagnostic tools in Angola, contact tracing apps in Ghana, mobile health information tools in Nigeria. The list is endless. All these innovations allowed us to reach more people with life-saving information, manage the spread of the virus, and protect our communities to the best of our ability. Over the last year and a half, across Africa, governments, private sector, civil society, and philanthropists have joined forces in an incredible effort to fight the pandemic. The global nature of COVID-19 meant countries that would traditionally ask Africa turned inward to deal with the crisis in their own localities. And the recent cuts to the UK aid budget demonstrate these changes taking place within the global sphere. As Africans, we therefore need to step up and commit to working together to ensure that we protect as many lives as possible and preserve future generations. We know that philanthropy has the most impact when it is catalytic, when it works within an ecosystem and comes together to achieve audacious goals. I'm very excited to be part of the recently announced Core Impact Gender Fund, where philanthropists, corporates, foundations, donors, this project, the visionary is Melinda Gates, have set out a goal to raise $1 billion over the next 10 years in order to achieve better outcomes to 100 million women and girls. I'm working with the African Philanthropy Forum to raise and lead an African cohort, which will contribute to this effort. Giving together in a network, there's so much more that we can do than trying to do it one person at a time. This is an opportunity for African women and men as well to stand in the gap and unlock opportunities for women and girls across the continent. As we discuss and deliberate over the next 3 days, we must look beyond COVID and see that the lessons that we are learning now, the true power of agency, agility, innovation, and collaboration will prepare us for an even greater future. There are a number of shifts occurring globally which point towards Africa becoming the most important continent in the world. By the year 2100, 1 in 3 people on the planet will be born on the sub-Saharan African continent. Nigeria will overtake China in population, becoming the 2nd largest country after India. Our world is becoming increasingly African, and we have the opportunity to lead. I want to close where we began with a stark reality that we are facing today: vaccine inequity. Over the past several years, I have seen and witnessed amazing leadership from people like Dr. John Kengasong, Director of Africa CDC. You're my hero. United Nations Under Secretary General Vera Songwe, she deserves the Peace Award. Professor Benedict Orama, President of Afri-Exim Bank, amazing leadership. And also, to some extent, the UN Special Envoy, Strive Masiwa, he's done pretty well. They have worked extremely hard to champion and facilitate access to vaccines, test kits, PPE, critical health equipment for all African countries. And more importantly, they have used their voices and their experience and their expertise courageously to force the hand of Western governments to try to be fair in vaccine distribution. I also want to give recognition to the former AU chairperson, President Ramaphosa, who during his tenure began the process of mobilizing and assembling the different leaders from various sectors. He did an extremely important job and we are where we are because of the hard work that he did. I'm also excited to say that in the next few days, we'll see 400 million vaccines begin to move all over the African continent, thereby preventing a repeat of what happened with HIV and AIDS. With HIV and AIDS, it took 8 years before we got access to medicines and medical care. And in the process, we lost more than 10 million people. This time, it will not be so. So thank you so much to everybody who has played a part. Congratulations again on putting up an important platform for discussions such as this one. I'm thrilled to be part of a cohort of leaders on the continent who are doing our best to make a difference. God bless you and have an excellent program. Thank you.
We also have Grace Mainingi. Grace is a human rights lawyer who's been working over the last 20 years in the governance of the nonprofit sector in Kenya. And she was recently appointed as the executive director of the Kenyan Community Foundation. Grace, welcome, and we're looking forward to hearing from you as well on the experiences coming out of Kenya, as well as coming out of East Africa.
Thank you so much, Masego, and all the organizers for the conference for this opportunity. Just to share with you briefly what we've been able to do at KCDF. I thought the best way to represent this is through pictures. So there is a presentation that should be coming up on the screen soon, just to show you what we've been able to do as KCDF. Now, as you've heard, I've just recently joined KCDF. And so this is really a celebration of the work that has been done by my colleagues and especially by my predecessor, Janet. So a big shout out to Janet. When COVID actually then affected Kenya, which began in March, and we can move to the next slide, there was a sense of what are we going to do? And as like Marwa has said, there was a lot of concern because a lot of Kenyans were not going to be able to make their daily living wage because of having to work every day and being able to have that access to resources. So the challenge came in terms of how do we be able to provide support for these vulnerable families that they would be able to at least go through and be able to survive through this particular pandemic. So as you'll see in the slide, it should move to the next slide, is that we had to actually see how do we pivot? How do we ensure that we are able to raise resources for emergency relief, but conscious that we could not be able to do this in the situation that we're in because of the lockdowns that we had. And so we had to really focus on working through what we call our community-based organizations, CBOs, that had better footprint throughout the country and were able to reach really what we would call the last mile, where the last people were who really needed the support. But even as we did that,
oh no, we seem to be losing Grace. Hi, Grace, we lost you.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, thank you. Please proceed.
Great. Did you lose me while speaking about the community outreach?
Yes.
Okay, so what I was explaining is that we had to work through community-based organizations that have a footprint throughout the country. And therefore, it was important for us to work with them so that we could be able to reach people at the farthest corner. But as we did this work, and
Grace, we've lost you again. Perhaps you could switch off your camera. That might help.
Masego, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Okay, I'll put my video off. Maybe that will make things a bit easier. And it's ironical, I'm talking about the digital divide, and that's where my technology is letting me down. And so what we realized is that a number of the organizations that we were working with really would require technical support to be able to actively and holistically work from home. So being a TechSoup partner, we were able to support a number of these organizations with online support, courses to help them understand how to use Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and issues around cloud security, just to ensure that a lot of the organizations we work with were able to transition quickly, that they would be able to manage, collaborate, and communicate, even without having to lose the support that and the touch that they needed to be able to do this. So from working from home, being able to do this, one of the things we put in place, as you'll see in the next slide, is that we had to ensure that internally we had in place a committee that was able to quickly reach out to the community-based organizations and was able to find out what do we need, what support is required. For us to be able to reach the community-based organizations, give them the funds they required, because we do grant making. We simplified our application process, our reporting templates, so that it would be a lot easier for these organizations to access the much needed support that they needed. But in doing this, we needed to keep in touch regularly with the funders, being able to report and show them then the impact of the work that was going on. So as you move to the next slide, what you will see is that we did have a lot of support that came in, not only in terms of cash support, but we also had in-kind support. And for our first phase, which we called between April and May, which was really at a time when things were extremely critical for the country to be able to address the pandemic, we ensured that we were able to work with the different organizations, and we were able to reach over 10,000 vulnerable households. But we were able to do this because we had a lot of support from individuals, from the private sector, from religious communities. And through that work, being able to raise different resources that we needed, both in cash and in kind. And like I said, working through the community-based organizations to get that support to where it was most needed. If you move to the next slide, you'll be able to see that different organizations came together to support the work. There you can see we had support even from the Shri Visual Osho community. There they are giving in-kind support, and that's my predecessor Janet receiving some of that support. And where did it go? It was able to go to the most vulnerable. And one of the partners that we worked with is the Disabled Empowerment Society of Kenya, really making sure that all what was put together in the care packages was able to go where it was required. And we do give a lot of, we do really appreciate the support that we received to be able to do that. Now, if we can move to the next slide, I'll be able to then show you then how we've been able to move on. And from June last year, we realized that as COVID was still with us in the country, and we were going to have to also change our mindset. We needed to move to making sure that we could rebuild the society, but also that we could sustain what we were doing in terms of community response. Because even as we're still dealing with the pandemic, we needed to make sure that even with whatever lockdowns that were instituted, that communities were able to continue to sustain themselves and able to move on in this situation that we're in. And this was the time when people were saying, this isn't a pandemic that is with us for only 3 months. It might be with us for over a year, over 3 years. How do we continue being able to sustain ourselves? So at this point, we put in place a number of income generating activities to make sure that the communities we work with could be able to also then shift from what they were able to do at that time, but to meet market demand. There's a lot of market demand for soap. There's a lot of demand for masks. And so being able to ensure that we assisted them to get the support that they needed to start up small businesses and be able to take up this work. So through the table banking, selling of crafts, they were able also then to pivot themselves and move more in a sustainable manner. There was also a lot of focus on agribusiness, making sure that we could support and give a lot of startups work around kitchen gardens so that they could be able to move forward and support their families. And a very practical, one of the practical things that the team was able to do was to procure epilepsy medication because we saw that a number of the beneficiaries were affected because of a breakdown of supplies. So being able to do and undertake that procurement. If we move to the next slide, there in that picture, you're just seeing a community meeting whereby the group is able to speak and say, this is what we need. How do we be able to move forward? And what we focused on is making sure that we had co-creation processes. We were able to discuss with the different communities, where are we, what do we most need to be able to rebuild and sustain? What do we have in our hands? So in the next slide, what you see there is being able to demonstrate in terms of the support we were able to give, the farming projects that were able to be undertaken at this time. And we're grateful to all the support and the funders who were able to support the projects that we currently have ongoing over 12 counties. As I come to a close, if we move to the next slide, we've been able to both raise resources locally and internationally. But I think some of the things that helped and have continued to help us moving forward is flexible funding. This has allowed us to be innovative, has allowed us to be able to see where are the greatest needs. Also, the co-creation that we were able to undertake with the community enabled us to make sure we narrowed down on sustainable approaches, not what we thought works best from sitting in a desk in Nairobi, but what works best at the local level. Community giving, which I hope I'll speak to a bit more later on, and also then the digital adaptations for the community-based organizations. So we gave both hardware and we're giving both software support. Thank you so much, and I look forward to coming back to this. Thank you, Masego.
We also have Jeremy Marman, and Jeremy has over 17 years experience in the community development and has worked for the government at all levels.
I wanted to share with you a short video, basically first and foremost on what is a community foundation, just for you to get a quick sense on how we as a foundation, newly formed community foundation, express and share with our people what we do. So just a quick video.
What is community philanthropy, you might ask? Community philanthropy is the process of gaining the support of local citizens, leveraging resources, and determining the use of resources in that area to better address challenges or to improve the quality of life in a community. Let's look at community philanthropy through the analogy of watering a plant with a bucket. The water in the bucket represents the accumulation of funds and the plant represents the development opportunities or needs in the community. If individuals, local organizations, the government and corporations invest funds, the bucket would be filled up and in return the plant would receive water and grow. If the process continues, the plant will seed and an entire garden will be formed.
My name is Logan Rangasamy. I'm the academic director at the Wits Business School. I'm extremely honored to moderate this session, given the prestige of this conference and also the caliber of our speakers. Una, I'm going to hand over to you firstly. You occupy the chair in philanthropy at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. We are very honored and privileged to be associated with your school. We look forward to your intervention.
You can't really assess impact after the fact. So for many funders, they want to know what impact did those dollars have on food insecurity, on domestic violence, on the environment, on healthcare. Thinking ahead, and here we do have an opportunity because as we see on the African continent, we can actually have very significant impacts by working at the grassroots, by working with many of the local partners, but building that capacity at the onset is really critical. So if we've learned anything from this crisis, it's the importance of data. It's very hard to think about impact, effectiveness, even issues of equity, if you can't actually point to these results. So I do think all of us have learned that. And at the Lilly Family School in particular, it's been a very inspiring moment, because we've been able to see that a lot of the tracking and systems we've put in place have been really useful. Funders have really wanted to access that data, and going forward, my hope is really that we can not just use the systems we have, but actually invest in research and infrastructure so that we are more than prepared to have, as we've emphasized, a more equitable, a more just sector, and ultimately economy in many African countries.
I'm going to hand over to Claire. Claire Woodcroft is the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. She has over 25 years of experience in the field of socio-economic development and philanthropy in emerging markets. She was the former CEO of the Emirates Foundation, where she led the organization's transition from traditional grant making to the model of venture philanthropy. What role can we play in academia to more or less infuse, some of these philanthropic, initiatives into our curriculum to more or less, bring about the desired, outcomes?
We fundamentally believe that business schools are essentially about organizational efficiency, and that's one of the core challenges when you look at philanthropic interventions in emerging markets, is that often you don't have the institutional structures and resilience that Ali was talking about to ensure that interventions are long-term and scalable. So a lot of what we look at in our executive education program is how do you build organizational and institutional resilience? How do you build partnerships that work? How do you measure your impact? How do you build that capacity to measure impact? How do you use your brand more effectively? What should governance look like? So all those things that are kind of taught anyway to a broader business and a broader business faculty context, those are equally important for social purpose organizations.
My name is Mosunla Ayode, and I'm the Executive Director of the African Philanthropy Forum. I'm happy to welcome our keynote speaker for Day 2, Eva Joyce Wynne. EJ, as she's popularly known, has been an active feminist and social justice movement in her country, Zimbabwe, the African continent, and globally for over 30 years. She started her development career in a Zimbabwean feminist organization, Women's Action Group.
It's an intentional process to fundamentally change the structures that cause systems to behave in particular ways. Because if we don't do this, we will keep on trying to address what one can say are simply the consequences or the manifestations of something that is much deeper rooted than what we are seeing. And I want to say, everybody now knows with COVID, and I will come back to this, we all know that with COVID, yes, it manifested itself as a health crisis, and certainly the implications have been felt firstly in terms of the health impacts, but actually COVID was much more than a health crisis. And we all know this. I think there has been enough written, there's been enough research, there's been enough said, but I think it's important to remind ourselves, and that those problems didn't just start today. So all COVID did was to magnify the underlying structural problems that we have in our individual countries, in the continent as a whole, but also in the global system as it is currently arranged. If we don't address root causes of what led to something like COVID, then we will keep on doing the band-aids, as we would say. We will keep bandaging, over a very deep fracture in some cases, but very often, because we are who we are, we can keep addressing the manifestations and in some senses giving cover, right? Or letting off the hook those people, those institutions that need to be held accountable or whose ways of making decisions, of allocating resources needs to be questioned and challenged. And I think that's what's important, that as people in the philanthropy world, we need to realize that we can only go this far, right? In terms of our interventions. We cannot solve all of the world's problems. Yes, we are amazing at what we do, but at the end of the day, we are not the elected governments of our countries. We are not the duty bearers in our countries. And certainly our influence is limited, by the systems and structures that we have in place, all over the world. What exactly is localization? Is there no local in Canada and is there no local in France? But that's a conversation for another day. So basically they're talking about the fact that you and me, the people that we care about, the communities that we work with, should be in the driving seat of development work, right? That's essentially, that's what it is. Decisions should be made at the site of struggle. It's the people who are experiencing the issues who should be in the driving seat, not only of articulating the problems, but also articulating the solutions, because they know their situation better, right? So for the INGOs, it's a question of their legitimacy right now, which is being questioned. It's a question of their survival, because some of the donor money they have been getting has definitely been cut quite severely. But for us, it's actually about reclaiming what should always have been ours, right? And so we have demonstrated this, as I said earlier. The issue right now is, how do we hold on to those gains that we made in COVID and make sure that we don't move from that space? Because certainly it is us and the communities that we work with and the people we care about who should be in that driving seat and who should continue, whether there is, COVID or not. The whole issue of accountability to affected communities is another conversation, that is there right now in terms of system change, right? And for a very long time, we have seen how the humanitarian sector in particular tends to be unaccountable to people who are directly impacted. I could tell you endless stories about what often happens when a disaster strikes, but that will be for another day.
Thank you so much. Moving on, we will go straight into the panel that I will be moderating. We are going to be, we've heard about systems change. We've been talking about systems change all morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, so we need to talk about what are the requirements of systems change in Africa. And with me today, I have a panel of speakers that will be speaking to the issues. I have Francois Bonisi, the director of Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship, Tanya Masiyiwa, the executive director of Delta Philanthropies, and Shami Suryanirayan, chief impact officer of Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator.
Other people come to the topic of systems change and say it's really about power, which EJ spoke about quite extensively as well. And so it's actually requiring that the systems were designed intentionally to control and oppress and retain power in certain camps and remove power from others. And so if you speak to different people on the spectrum from development through to activism, you get very different perspectives of what a system change is. So I think what I have been working on, and for those of you who may know a little bit, I'm a medical doctor by training and kind of very much was exposed to the intersectionality of issues when looking at health. And I think we've seen that exposed now through COVID. I've also, like EJ referred to, worked in an academic environment and built the Bertha Center for Social Innovation at the University of Cape Town, which was trying to then say, okay, well, we need African universities also looking at how social change happens, and we need to actually be supporting local solutions. Through that process, I became quite frustrated with the term systems change because it seemed so unattainable. It seemed in a way we're talking about it, we recognize it needs to happen, but we don't know how to do it. And that's been kind of 5 years of work looking at organizations that seem to be successful in changing policies, in starting to break out of cycles of poverty traps, of really building and empowering citizens and communities to take ownership of their destiny. And we started to look at organizations that did that and looked at, okay, well, what are they doing that is different to how we've been doing social change and how we've been doing development before? And that's culminated in a book that's coming out in a couple of weeks' time called The Systems Work of Social Change. And so we've really wanted to bring emphasis that this is about the work we need to do now, not about some grand ambition we have for the future. It's not that we mustn't be ambitious, but the ambition needs to play out today in how we do our work. And I think the emphasis of what I have learned by observing and working very closely with many organizations is really about the depth of their work. And I think EJ spoke to this. It's about context, it's about relational connections, and it's really about shifting power. And so I think part of that system change that EJ spoke about is one that we, as part of the social change industry, actually need to change ourselves in order to see those kinds of changes. And EJ spoke about decolonizing development and decolonizing philanthropy. We also need to deindustrialize it. The first chapter of this book is called The Industry of Social Change. In fact, we've been, even the words we use, militarized words, how we've designed organizations, even the word impact is quite a powerful, forceful word. And we've been so obsessed with outcomes. And yes, of course, we need to aim for those outcomes, but actually the way to achieve those outcomes and what we've seen in organizations is how the work is done and how important the process of social change is. And focusing on that. And what we discovered is that actually this work is going on, that so many organizations are working systemically, working locally, working to empower in ways that are building kind of collectives to do, to empower people to do their own, to have kind of power over their own destiny. And I think that the changes that come in how we think about how organizations do that work is actually allowing a space, and as philanthropists, allowing a space for organizations to have much more control, power, and determination of what they should be doing. And that's what I think we've seen during COVID. She spoke to the innate capabilities of people. I mean, everyone in the chat says, we know that's there. So what we do and how we do it needs to shift a little bit. And so I think the kind of the most important kind of takeaways from us is that actually empowering people who live the challenges we talk about and who work on the front lines, and that the rest of us who work in this industry somehow need to shift. And I think what we spell out in the book is looking at this deep hidden work that we don't ask organizations about, that isn't measured, that isn't funded, that isn't resourced, that isn't managed. And it's the day-to-day practice of how we do social change is going to lead to these ambitions we have for systemic change.
We need to really think of what words we get obsessed with. So I feel like scale was the huge obsession of the past decade. And I sense that systems change is going to start to become that obsession this next decade. And even though we are moving from scale to systems change, which is a pretty big pivot, and I'll talk about 3 specific areas where we're pivoting, I would argue that we really need to think about what is the ultimate outcome and how do we incentivize the right behaviors in addition to just looking for outcomes. I mean, 500,000 pathways sounds fantastic, but it's not nearly enough. And we realize, South Africa had the terrible sort of, incidences of the past few weeks of the riots in KZN, et cetera, which have now deepened the real deep divides that have already existed because of COVID. So we realized in our journey from scale to systems change, 3 big lessons. One is scale isn't enough, but adoption at scale is quite critical. And what do I mean by that? It means, we started out by offering skills training, certification, and matching to young people through a platform, which was originally on our Mobi site, harambe.mobi. This past month, actually in June, we launched a platform in partnership with the government, with the South African presidency, called sayouth.mobi. And our technology, our platform, our cheap and efficient means of getting jobs to be visible to young people and young people visible to jobs was adopted by the government, which I know is still a small thing, but like it's, scale isn't enough. A lot of funders look for hockey sticks and how many people reached, et cetera. But if you aren't able to actually address how the innovation that you're producing as a social enterprise can be adopted at scale, I do think that systems change will still be elusive. So that's one big lesson. We have to fall in love with the problem and not the solution. And again, that is about understanding really the complexities that, Francois talked about, the layers and layers of barriers that young people face. It isn't enough that we have a clever product or a clever idea. We do have to constantly iterate to actually address the big picture problem. And I'll give quite specific examples. We early on in Harambe's journey to placing young people at work realized that there were huge barriers because of transport, high costs of data, which is not just having a mobile phone, but even having internet access plus data costs, qualifications, and importantly, childcare. This past year alone showed us that access to childcare was a huge factor in getting young women back to work. So we realized that, even though we were able to connect young people to work quickly, could we zero rate, which is, drop the data cost of our site entirely, so that young people could quickly access jobs online. So that was a huge, realization and an innovation that we adopted. Transport and childcare are really thorny problems, no matter where you are on the continent. But can we generate more jobs in the ECD, the early childhood sector, to get more young women working and young women into work? So thinking of, redesigning your innovation to address the real problem rather than sticking with your solution is a really key sort of interest in finding that we've learned along the way. And the third thing is moving away from what we do as a social enterprise to what needs to be done as a system. And I'll give a very specific example of gender. I mean, both EJ and Francois mentioned this in passing, but I feel like usually when you have a crisis, you say women and children first out. I think the pandemic has laid bare the fact that actually women and children, and women in particular, came last. And this was evident in every single design of all structures, all policies. A very specific example in South Africa was the UIF and TERS grant. Great as though it was an unemployment insurance fund. Majority of recipients of that fund were actually not women, even though they were the most impacted by job losses. Why was this the case? It was because women were in more precarious jobs that didn't have access to insurance. So that again thinks of, okay, what is the problem? And it's not just enough that we get young people, young women working and linking them to work. Let's think of what needs to be done as a system. And how do we do this as social enterprises, as funders? It's through partnerships. I think it's about thinking of linking up with other organizations that aren't just, focused on your particular area, but are thinking of this holistically. So for me, I think there's three big lessons in terms of our pivot from just scale alone to systems change: adoption at scale versus scale alone, falling in love with the problem, and thinking of what needs to be done versus what we do ourselves. I mean, I'll come back to some provocations to the funder community, but these are just some early lessons in our journey. We're just starting out as a systems change agent in South Africa, but really excited to learn from the others on this panel as well.
Really, I've been in this space for over 20 years. And, the word scale is so important to us when we're writing reports. And it's important that we're, you talked about moving from scale, now we're talking about systems change, and there's the trap of, getting caught in the same trap that we got caught in the past. And that's something for funders to look out for. I've never wanted to fall in love with the problem, but, the way you spoke about it, I really do understand the need to, because we need to understand or just break down the problem enough to design the appropriate solutions to address those problems. And you talked about just moving from what you are doing as a social enterprise to looking at the entire system and thinking about partnerships. And that is the perfect segue to speak to donors, donors who are funding systems change. They are funding work in this space. They are very much interested in the solution as much as we are. And I'm going to move on to Tanya Masiwa on this. From a donor's perspective, can you tell us what it's been like getting into the space, understanding systems change, speaking to collaborators, looking at the whole value chain of the issues that we have and seeing how we can bring everyone that is important along that value chain together to solve the problem?
Something that was extremely pivotal to how we look at systems change was when we decided that we wanted that we came up with something called Vision 2050. And many nations have many visions. Zimbabwe, we have Vision 2030. But Vision 2050 was a commitment that we wanted to see some of our African nations become middle income economies by 2050. And that forced us to look at our philanthropy with a different lens. In a flick of a second, you began to see what it takes to shift the needle in Africa. So whilst we were working predominantly in education, it forced us to look at issues like not just girl empowerment, but gender justice. It forced us to look at issues like food security in a much more different way. And as a foundation, we began to break those silos. So where we've invested heavily in education in the last 25 years, when we look forward, seeing where Vision 2050 is going, it has completely shifted the way that we are allocating our funding, because we've been exposed to what it's going to take to shift the needle, and it's no longer enough for us to look at some of our challenges in a much more siloed approach. So I hope that answers your question at least a little bit, Mosin.
Thank you, Tanya. It certainly did. I think something you said struck me at the beginning. We know this as Africans, but sometimes we tend to forget. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter how insulated you think you are. The problem is coming to your doorstep. And that we constantly have to remember as we address the issues that we're faced with. And it was interesting to hear that, as a family foundation and as a family, the different ways you engaged through the process of the pandemic. And I shouldn't even use the past tense because I know it is still going on. And the final one, which is for me very important in the development space, is I love the fact that philanthropists are beginning to look at how they're allocating resources based on what has happened with the pandemic, and priorities are changing, and they're looking at where investments will have the most impact and have a sustainable impact, if I'll put it that way.
The one kind of reflection on scale is sometimes that obsession with scale, but also that drive for scale was sometimes perpetuating some of the problems, right? Without actually really understanding, as Sharmi said, what needs to be done, as opposed to like this solution we're doing, let's just scale it. And so I think the clear answer is no. I think there's an interesting place for big bets, and clearly in things like, okay, we need to develop a vaccine and throw a couple of $1 billion at it, and that's clearly there's space for some of those. But the worry is that you scale up or you perpetuate some things that are actually problematic for a whole bunch of reasons that we may have spoken about, or you hugely empower a single organization and crowd out a number of other actors that Sharmi has said we need to work with big and small. Tanya has spoken about the work that needs to be done both at the kind of significant policy level as well as at the communities on the ground. And so I think the interesting perspective on big bets might be those that are also looking to support those collectives. And Sharmi spoke about ways in which donors are reflecting on, well, how should we be thinking about funding systemically? No one knows really is the answer, but I think the approach that Sharmi mentioned was bring organizations together that are working in a similar field or a connected field or in a sector, and allow them. I mean, we write about this in the book, but both on measuring kind of progress around systems change as well as funding it, creating containers, creating spaces for organizations to learn together. And it's really about bringing it back to the heart of learning, right? Creating spaces for those organizations to start thinking and working together and providing resources for things that seem like they don't have immediate tangible outcomes.
My name is Giradilo Mohotsi, and I'm a lecturer at the Wits Business School CAPSI Center. The first person that will share their story of innovation and technology is Dr. Tendai Murisa of the Sivia Institute that is based in Harare. Tendai is a development practitioner. He's worked for many, many years in the space and also for CAPSI. He conducts research in philanthropy, public policy, land reforms, you name it. And he continued to conduct some research during those awkward lockdown moments. So tonight, a warm welcome to you. Please take everybody through how you managed to reinvent and innovate yourself and your organization.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kara. I'll start off by just sharing my screen. It's a story about how we adapted to COVID-19 related changes and challenges. We continued to leverage technology, but we did not stop with our research. We actually took advantage of the moment and expanded into the region. So we've just completed a study, and now we're going live with it on citizenship and giving in 5 countries: Cameroon, Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. And like I said, the assessments of service delivery. And also, because of our size and our budgets, for dialogues, we'll have to hire hotel rooms, etc. But COVID-19, because of people cannot travel, we took advantage of that, and we became so aggressive on pushing the dialogue platform because we're using the online platforms. And on average, we actually moved our subscription. Initially, we had the entry-level subscription on Zoom where we're sort of hosting 100 people. We ended up getting another subscription where we can host up to around 500 people. Because one thing that we realized, people were at home and they had time to discuss the things that matter to them as far as democracy is concerned, etc. And this was ongoing. And we also became a resource for others. We were recently asked to host a conference, an online conference by a German development agency in Zimbabwe, based on the sort of the reports we're churning out, the work that we had done during the peak of the lockdowns. Some of the lessons learned quickly. I think with no doubt, technology is the future. As nonprofits working in the philanthropy space, NGOs, etc., it actually, in a way, it actually increases our capacities 100-fold, 10-fold with small budgets. But I think we need to be alert to the fact that even Eva Joyce mentioned in your main address to say technology can also build inequality. Many of our stakeholders cannot afford the cost of being online. So for most of our online training, we're offering data scholarships. We made sure that we're providing data scholarships monthly, not only for our participants, even for our resource persons that were coming to do live lectures, etc. But also it provides us with possibilities of scaling beyond Zimbabwe. It disrupts the space based on, if you look at the cost to do travel, hiring hotels, there's certain initiatives that you can run from one little center across the continent. And we found that we could do this with the Africa Citizenship Index. We could carry out research in 5 cities over a period of 2 months, thanks to technology, and the data was coming back to us in real time. I would say that we need to be continuously innovating on the margins. I think one of the things that we need to be careful about, even though we're working based on technology, is we need to watch out for team burnout. By the time we're getting to March 2021, we're moving at a very fast pace without realizing it, because everything is happening on a platform, etc. But you don't realize the amount of hours you're spending on platforms like this. So we've had now to be very deliberate that every quarter, every half year, we make sure that some colleagues are actually going away on leave to take rest, etc. This is very important because you are far away from each other. You don't see the signs of fatigue, but it's something that you have to watch out for. Thank you so much, Kara.
Let me introduce our next speaker, who is very unique. His name is Oswald. Oswald is unique in the sense that he lives and breathes IT. So he's a tech IT guru. He's been doing this for many, many years, and COVID made him rich. So he's also like Zoom. Everybody started buying Zoom licenses. Oswald made a lot of money during COVID, helping all of us to innovate. So I'm very excited to hear from you, Oswald, what you were doing during COVID and what you continue to do today. Welcome, Oswald.
Thanks very much, Kira. I think the rich part probably it's a bit of an exaggeration, right? But thank you very much for that, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure speaking to you all. And thanks for CAPSI and Wits University and all the stakeholders that have brought us together today. As Kira highlighted, I'm just a big fan of tech. And I believe that COVID was, to the technology ecosystem, a big opportunity, number one. And it was also a point of reckoning because it came at a time where many organizations that are in the technology space potentially were not ready. And I like the fact that people quickly forget. But if you really remember the first days of COVID, Zoom was crashing every other day. And the Zoom guys had to really perfect their infrastructure to meet the demand. So one of the key things that I would say that we have seen during this COVID period is the acceleration of digital transformation of any industry on this continent. It was important to keep digital records. And where we are going as a global community, it is going to be difficult to travel across Africa and across the world without a digital COVID passport. So gone are the days of the paper-based yellow fever card to the digital EVD type system for collecting COVID data. So the vaccine digital passport is going to become a norm. We've been working with Africa CDC on this platform, and we've developed a solution that we are going to be deploying across Africa to address this element of travel in the digital era of COVID. And also another element that we were very much integral in putting together was this Africa Medical Supplies platform. So my chairman Strive was very instrumental, having been appointed the special envoy by President Ramaphosa, who was the chairman during the time of COVID, to develop an e-commerce type platform, which saw all African countries coming together, the NGO development community, governments came together, and then we developed this platform, which is now distributing vaccines across the continent. Gone are the days where Africa has to rely on international community to get donations for us to get vaccines. So the African Union and AVAT, Africa CDC, have come together, acquired through Afri-Exim Bank 400 million vaccines, which are being distributed through this Africa Medical Supplies platform to all countries across the continent. To me, this is one of the biggest achievements of the African continent, where we now start owning our narrative, where we now start owning the solution to our problems. However, the digital platforms bring transparency. They also bring visibility. They also bring the aggregated advantages of Africa. 1.2 billion people, we have to take a seat when it comes to the manufacturing of vaccines. We are bigger than the US, we are bigger than Europe. So why do people not listen to us? However, if we come together through a digital platform, define our needs, define our logistic strategies, define our demands, and be able to support the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and come together leveraging on technology and address this COVID problem. Over the years, I've been knocking on doors of many African governments regarding digital adoption in the healthcare space. With COVID, that conversation turned sides. It was the governments who were coming to us, asking for digital solutions. So digital health is now a reality. And as it becomes a reality, it is going to potentially address a number of challenges we have on this continent. What we have now seen is telemedicine has become a regulated service. You can now talk to your doctor over Zoom. It was not possible some years ago, but people did not understand that. But now doctors appreciate the fact that due to actually the need to be distant from their patients, the best way to consult is telemedicine. So as these technologies are being deployed, we are playing a very significant role around the connectivity that supports that, the data storage from data centers, and also building some of those applications. So for me, this period of COVID has been a great opportunity. We've been tested in terms of our skills, our capability of defining solutions. However, the positive thing that I would like to leave all of you with is, let's not let these gains be lost, because all the advantages COVID has brought, let's embrace them. Let's not burn out like Marisa said earlier on. However, let's embrace this technology and adapt it for education, adapt it for digital skills development, adapt it for running different social impact projects across the continent.
Good afternoon and welcome to parallel session number 2. Tendisai Chigwedere. She's the learning manager at Trust Africa. Her journey has taken her from sitting with and learning from communities in urban, marginalized areas in Washington, D.C., Sacramento, and Cairo, to a deep dive investigative journalism, community organizing, and advocacy in Honduras and Mexico. As a connector and proponent of facilitating space for innovation, dialogue, and collective solutions, she co-hosted the first TEDx Harare in 2011 and was also a key part in the work that led to the launch of Moto Republic as Zimbabwe's first creative hub.
Over the years, as Trust Africa, we've really been privileged to create space and enhance collective capabilities for communities to self-organize and generate the solutions and thought leadership around the complexity of issues they're facing. I think after all, who knows better what's needed for development than the very community that's sidelined from the gains of extractive industry that's taken over a town or a village, or the smallholder farmers who are adversely affected by policies that disenfranchise them. And communities now more than ever are longing for effective and accessible ways to participate in shaping their future. There was an article in The Guardian earlier this year, I think it was April this year, where Mark Lowcock, the coordinator of the UN's aid relief operation since 2017, was quoted as saying that the humanitarian system is set up to give people in need what international agencies and donors think is best and what we have to offer, rather than giving people what they themselves say they most need.
We are going to be hearing from Halima Mohammed, who a lot of us know. Halima is a senior African philanthropy fellow at Trust Africa and an independent philanthropy researcher and consultant focusing on knowledge building and advocacy, advancing the narratives, practice, and impact of philanthropy in Africa. Halima serves, amongst others, as a member of the PSJP management team, Alliance Magazine editorial board, and is an associate researcher at the Center for African Philanthropy and Social Investment.
In this pandemic, the development sector has been talking about community action networks, others are talking about community-based crowdfunding, but to many of these givers, these terms are alien. You know, what they're doing today is building on what they or what their community members were doing yesterday. There is a basis for how people behave. There are values and principles and systems that enable and motivate and push their actions forward. So, you know, when I think about the community hall in my in my hometown that was turned into a medical ward when there were no hospital beds available. This was eventually a collaboration between local philanthropic donations, community volunteers, and health volunteers and an organized NGO. But it was built on the practice of two medical doctors, two sisters who in the previous waves teamed up with a local voluntary ambulance service and did house-to-house visits for very ill patients. They organized oxygenators, they monitored in whatever ways they needed. In effect, they set up local roaming wards. And I have no doubt at all that those practices were based on other practices that these individuals have been engaged on before. But my point is that, you know, there are layers built on layers. In the area where I live today, it's a very diverse suburb, right? A group of people got together, put out a call on the local WhatsApp group for donations to buy oxygenators for community use. Within 2 days, they bought 5 machines, which are being lent out to any community member that needs it for however long they need it, completely free. But that group of people, completely informally, are probably the hub of people that are always rising when there's a need, whether it's an emergency, humanitarian, or otherwise.
African philanthropists, community-based organizations, and other social enterprises achieved all this without the help of the usual external experts, who have often cited the lack of capacity as a constraining factor in Africa. With COVID, travel restrictions have prevented the external experts from jetting in. Yet, African communities and organizations have proven that they have the capacity and depth to meet Africa's present needs when challenged. Local organizations and individuals became the first responders for the affected communities, showing innovation and resilience. Money and resources moved to areas of need, despite the complications and time-consuming procedures involved in moving money internationally and locally. The reality of women's groups that work on the front lines but are poorly funded became evident. COVID has exposed the limitations in how we work and what we choose to work on in the aid and philanthropic sector, and how some of the systems in which we have worked have not served us. How do local communities and local organizations hold on to the important gains they have secured during COVID? And how do we work together to bring about the systems change that COVID has made even more pressing? And let me invite Dr. Stigmata Tenga, who is Executive Director of the African Philanthropy Network, to share reflections.
Throughout this conference, we have heard how across the continent communities have stepped up to provide solutions to dealing with COVID-19, mobilize all kinds of resources from time to material, networks, intellectual capacity, you name it, to increase collective power to better respond. And this was not something that suddenly happened because of COVID-19, but something that had always been there in our communities. But what we hear this week is that COVID-19 has increased the visibility. These inclusive and caring practices are fundamental elements of all forms of African philanthropy. All speakers in different sessions, from keynote to parallel sessions, confirmed that when people contribute to their own resources, they become co-investors with a stake in their own development, and become more invested in acting in ways that advance and protect their collective interests and rights. And this is not localization, but community-led development that enables horizontal forms of accountability to emerge based on trust, mutuality, and transparency.
One of the questions that came up was, what exactly is the role of the AU, and how can the AU help in moving the needle of development? I believe that African philanthropists have a role to play in that regard. They have the influence, they have the power, they have the resources, and one of the roles that philanthropy support organizations such as ourselves can play is really bringing them around the table and getting them to the point where we're able to shift policy and shift systems at regional level that will translate into the national level and into our communities. So for me, that was a key one. It was a bit shocking, but it was also a rude awakening as to how much work we need to do in terms of telling our stories. The second I've touched on briefly is on systems change. APF recently got into the systems change space, and this conference pretty much underscored the importance of including donors in the systems change journey. And it's not just about giving, it's not just about understanding the concept, it's really understanding the role that philanthropists play in supporting collaborations that will shift systems, in understanding how the terms we use, the language we use can hinder the movement in this space. So there is a need for a change in mindset when we're talking about systems change, when we're talking about working with nonprofits and systems change orchestrators that are working in this space. How do we better work with them? How do we better understand the problems that they are trying to solve? And even understanding from the social enterprise point of view, not just the philanthropists, but also the nonprofit organizations, really understanding the problems enough to design solutions that will bring the philanthropists on board to say, yes, this is something I want to get behind. And I believe a coalition of philanthropists should get behind this for us to move further along even quickly.
We will move on to Evans Okinyi, please.
I think first and foremost, I would want to reiterate the critical roles that networks play in facilitating such strategic engagements towards the growth of philanthropy in the continent. We need more of such learning opportunities. We need to witness more of what we have seen in the last 3 days. A lot of knowledge has been generated. We have facilitated a lot of linkages. We have seen, and we need more of such so that we are able to spur cross-sectoral collaborations and engagements. And on that note, I want to extend a warm invite. More of the conversations which have been taking place in the last 3 days will be continuing at the East Africa Philanthropy Conference, which will serve and unite various philanthropy actors within the East Africa region and beyond in our 7th East Africa Philanthropy Conference, where we will be diving deeper into how do we re-engineer philanthropy, looking at how the sector needs to remain relevant while remaining resilient in the face of the pandemic that we are facing and beyond. We have seen from the speakers, from the many research findings that were shared by various organizations, the way philanthropy has grown, the way giving by Africans during this pandemic has really grown. For sure, I think Africa has risen to the occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to invest continually. And these are some of the lessons that we have picked, on behalf of VAPN, and we will be furthering some of these conversations at the regional level, as has been clearly articulated by Mosun. We need to continually shift our mindset and the mindset of people, the mindset of Africans, to believe and invest in our communities. We need to ensure that we end, in the best way possible, dependence on foreign aid, but we also need to echo our own giving as a continent. And this is a step ahead in promoting indigenous systems of giving that really exist within the continent.